Music really is there in everyone's life, and so it was in mine. But I was helped by my parents who really brought me and my sister, my only other sibling. They brought us up to really try and engage with the arts, and in particular music, and facilitated it for us. Very often, music is there in your life, but for some reason, guardians or your own circumstances don't make it possible for people to engage with the arts. In my case, my parents were music lovers. They facilitated our engagement with music and made it very easy for us, encouraged us greatly to learn music. And so music really was sitting right there in my life, but it was really the doors were opened by my parents, and music was allowed to flood into our lives. Every guru that I have learned from, you named some of them, but also I wanted to mention Pandit Vinay Chandra Maudgalya, who also was a prolific composer and whose compositions are sung by several artists. All of them really were Vagyakars, that is, they were actually composing the musical structure and rhythmic structure of each bandish, but were also writing the lyrics. And therefore, they had a deep engagement with Sahitya or literature, in each in their own different way. For me, really, the bandish is a kind of a musical seed idea. And that gives you, it has the power, the potent strength to develop into a much larger rendition, but it packs in so much. And this was one aspect of the bandish, which was explained um, carefully and in meticulous detail by each of my gurus who were teaching me, and in their own ways, of course. But the fact that the bandish provides a foundation for you to really build your vistar, your badhat, your elaboration upon, this was explained to me. So, in a sense, yes, I was told I was singing Ragdari music. I knew there was an element of very important element of tal in it. But how do you approach these various elements? It's you are steered towards that by the bandish. The bandish really gives you an encapsulated view of the rag. And of course, each one had their stylistic, very specific stylistic traits. And therefore, they approached them in different ways. Some of these great composers whom I learned from were not performers, not so much performers. They were like Pandit Ramashra Jhaji was a great scholar, composer, and he performed beautifully when he did perform, but he was not a mainstream performer. Similarly, Pandit Vinay Chandra Maudgalya was not a performer. And yet, their enjoyment of the music, their scholarship, their wisdom, their way of analyzing Rag Tal through the lens of the Bandish was very, very important. And it was a significant part of the talim or training that I received from them. Very often, I find that artists and vocalists and musicians treat teaching as a means of livelihood more than something that they approach with passion. Um, I have no hesitation in saying that for many, many decades now, it has been very difficult for musicians across the world to really make a living by doing just music. Therefore, people have, you know, chosen to adopt different strategies. Some remain part-time musicians, so they work at an office through the day and make music um, off office hours. Some choose teaching jobs to really sustain themselves, and they're not really interested in teaching. They're doing so because I'm not generalizing, but very often this happens that the a job to teach students either at a music school or at a university is one way of surviving, but that's not really what you really want to do. You wanted to be a performer, you wanted to be on the concert circuit, but couldn't, are not able to do it, and therefore you are teaching. That is the sort of bitter reality However, Pandit Vinay Chandra Maudgalya was passionate about teaching, and passionate in a way that you seldom find people being so passionate. Of course, the great pioneers who set up so many Gurukuls schools have all been passionate about teaching. So I'm not saying he was the only one, but his passion for teaching was just so wonderful to witness. He would work a full busy day at the Vidyalaya and yet find time for me if I asked him that I want to learn a particular rag or that I'm preparing for some concert and would he please check what I'm doing. There was never any question. I mean, whether it was 12 hours of teaching or whether it was 17, 18 hours of doing administrative work and teaching, there was never any hesitation in saying, yes, yes, let's go and see what you're doing. And I think that passion really drove him to create such a large number of students, all of whom, many of whom, remain engaged with music, even though they may not have taken up music full time. I think that really was just so wonderful to witness. I was not one of the fortunate students who learned from him for a long time, let's say a period of a decade or more. I only got to learn from him sporadically in the last 2 years of his life. And I consider myself very fortunate to have um, got this opportunity to learn from him. I really feel that I can't say how people misunderstood him, as happens with a lot of path breakers and people who have a very unique style. There are scores of people who swear by him and continue to try and imitate him almost, um, which is not what he may have wanted them to do. But there are also scores of people who feel no, they think only his bhajan singing was beautiful. I've even heard that. And others who don't agree with his perspective, his drishtikon of music. And I think that happens with every artist, particularly with people who have such an unique way of looking at everything, not just music. And I think for me, what was very important was that here was an artist whom I'd heard while I grew up in Allahabad. So Kumarji would visit Allahabad almost every year and perform once or twice at the home of the Verma family, which he was very close to. And the entire town of music lovers, anybody who was a music lover would be congregated there at their home to listen to Kumarji. So I had also been part of that. My parents were great admirers of his, and I had gone each time from whenever I can remember in my childhood and heard him. And certainly there was something just so unique, so Maulik about his style that I was startled when I first heard it. This idea of a rebel, somebody who takes his or her own path is almost, there is a sense of militancy in it. But I don't think I ever saw that in him. In fact, my first Talim session with him, and in several Talim sessions, he would always refer to traditional compositions while also teaching his own, so that you knew. And without his pointing out, I don't think his style of teaching, his pedagogy was about saying, note one, so and so Bandish presents Bhupali like this. Note two, point two, I don't present Bhupali like this. I don't think it was like that. He would place it before you. If you had the receptivity, fine. If you didn't, perhaps you needed to go back to the memory of that Talim session later and try and analyze. So I think, he had studied parampara and paramparic compositions very well, and only then chosen to move away from that. And I think in a traditional form of music like ours, this freedom is inherent in the tradition. It's we who sometimes forget and treat it like an orthodox monolith that can't be changed. And I think this, for me, is the most important, one of the most important lessons I got from him. If you do not know parampara, you cannot say, I have changed it. How dare you say it? So I think it was about first immersing yourself in the traditional compositions, in the many ways that the Buzurgs before you had been able to interpret rags, and only then saying with a sense of conviction that this is how I perceive it. I think this was one of the most important lessons, at least for me. Pandit Jitendra Abhisheki, of course, was also a wonderful composer himself, but he also had a huge repertoire, which he had acquired from several places. And I think it was that which brought him to Pandit Ramashray Jhaji to basically discuss and analyze his compositions, and also to acquire some of them. And then, interestingly, it was he who actually made them very popular in Maharashtra. So I think sadly a lot of people started singing Ramranji's compositions. It was Pandit Jitendra Abhisheki ji and earlier Pandit C.R. Vyas ji, who both really shared a deep bond with Ramranji. And I remember Ramranji mentions him mentioned him as Vyas Bua. He mentioned him as अरे वो महाराष्ट्र के खलीफा हैं and in a very fond way. And I think they really shared a bond, and they liked to get together to analyze how to approach different rags, what was the high point of a particular composition, how to look at different perspectives of, let's say, Jod rags. And I think Pandit Jitendra Abhisheki was also a deeply analytical, scholarly person who enjoyed all of this. And that's what probably made him come to Ramranji and also remain in touch with him for many years. I'm not from a family of musicians. My mother was a teacher of English literature at the University of Allahabad. My grandmother was also a teacher, had studied, had done a master's in mathematics, was born in 1900. But she was extremely fond of music, but did not get the opportunity, was not permitted the opportunity to learn Hindustani music by her family. However, she brought up her three daughters, including my mother, to learn music, encourage them greatly, but not to take it up as a full-time commitment or as a profession. And then my mother, who brought me up, again, taught me music, encouraged me to learn music, and then actually made it easy for me, sat me down after my graduation and said, listen, you seem really crazy about music. So if you want to do music, you need to make a full-time commitment to it. And so take a year off, don't apply for college right away. Sit down and think, if you want to do music, you must commit to it. And what a great opportunity that was. So for me, in my personal sphere, things obviously did improve. It is also true that women like me, who are first-generation musicians, have received the love, admiration, and respect of listeners from a large part of society. Today, we have been given awards, recognized for our commitment to music. And yet, somewhere deep down, there is this bias against women. It takes not a second for, let's say, a policymaker or a politician to run down women artists and worse, artists in general. In a flash, they are able to say, ye to gaane bajane wale hain, in a derogatory way, not in a nice way. Or and this is across parties. This has nothing to do with this party, this political party, or that political party. I can give you examples of major mainstream politicians saying this across parties. What is it about artists that makes people feel they can say so? When they want to pull in a crowd, when they give tickets to artists because they are public figures, they don't say these things, but it takes them just a flash to say such derogatory things about artists. And of course, about women too. With women, there is even a worse bias. And I think it's deep rooted. It's deep rooted like problems of caste, problems of related to communalism. I think it's deep rooted in our society. And until a major effort is made to cleanse this, our own arts community is not addressing it. Have we ever come out in the open and talked about these issues? I mean, this is the easiest thing to do, isn't it? But we never discuss these issues. Today, more than ever, social media has made it possible for us to speak to each other across continents in real time. Why are we not discussing these issues? You make a post about such an issue on any social media platform that you inhabit, and you see the trickle of responses you will get. You make a post posing like this and singing something, and you see what happens. So I think these are issues that our own arts community must first address. We must say we will not tolerate any such indignity that happens in any artist's life, not just ours. We may have been fortunate. We may not have encountered it, but if somebody else encounters it, we must take it up as a collective issue. This idea of discussing problems, of addressing them as a collective do not exist. And I think this is one of the major problems. How can we ask society to make it, to think differently if we ourselves are not thinking about this? Art has not been given due significance even in primary education and school education. So it's not only in higher education, but really speaking in our entire system. Even though we have been discussing this for a long time, I think it was in 2005 that I was the chairperson for the curriculum revision framework that happens at NCERT, where we discuss what can we do to revise the framework for every school-going student and to include or to then remove certain problematic issues. And I think it was from between 2005 to 2006 that we had intense discussions on how to include an arts education program, a robust arts education program, which does not emphasize performance and which does not only look at the classical arts, but which looks at arts in a much more holistic way. We had such wonderful discussions. We agreed and we disagreed and we argued with each other, but it was such a lovely experience. And we sent in a recommendation saying arts education must become something that is offered to every school-going student. And I can say that I really learned a lot during that period. Even though I was the chairperson, I was coming from the world of Hindustani classical music. I did not know so many aspects of the arts because India is too diverse and richer and varied a country, And then in one of the discussions, one of the people who was a field officer at NCERT made such an important and startling revelation. He said, 1 minute, I think what all of you are saying is wonderful. And yes, people should learn classical music and folk music, etc. But he said, at that point of time, the government had made provisions to pay the salary of one teacher in every school that had about 50 children. He said that according to his survey, many of these schools didn't even have a building. They were schools that were run between two let's say between two trees in a field, and little portions would be marked out for, let's say, under 6 children and under 10 years of age. And they would be made to sit in little groups, and one single teacher was teaching them all subjects. Now, this gentleman pointed out to us, so you are telling me that this particular teacher will teach them, apart from everything else that he or she is teaching them, will also teach them Darbari and Malkons and Yaman? And how ridiculous is it to expect that? So, and we were all silent for a while and realized that the resources, where are the textbooks to teach any such thing? Where are the games to teach any such thing? Where are the teacher training programs to teach teachers how to teach such things? And I think all of that was discussed. I know that the recent education policy that was sort of really mentions that the arts must be given priority. And yet, until we have all of this put in place, how are we going to do this? And are we only going to aspire to teach? Do you think it's possible for millions of kids to start singing Yaman, or to start dancing Bharatanatyam, or to do Odissi? It's not possible. So, but they can enjoy it, and they can be touched by music in a way that we know will sensitize them, make them better human beings. So I think we certainly, there have been attempts to include the arts in mainstream education, but unfortunately, it's been hugely delayed. It hasn't been thought about practically. And the many building blocks that need to be put together to make the jigsaw come together, those things haven't happened. It is with the deepest sense of regret that I have to say that in these 18 months, I have not seen any measure taken by either the government at the center or even by states that could be applauded, that could be lauded. Yes, there have been some attempts to provide a small amount of money. Let me just share that amount with you, because it will give you a sense of how little has been done. So let's say something like 2,000 rupees to be given one time to even a group of folk musicians, but only after they submit a video of their performance. And if that video is approved, will they get 2,000 rupees? Now, if there are 10 people in that group, what is the amount that they receive? 200 rupees in 18 months. And let us not forget that COVID-19 and the pandemic has hit every single person, Raja or Rank, anybody. And even among the artists, there is no single artist who can say, oh, I'm fine, I'm fortunate. Yes, we are privileged. Many of us are privileged. Many of us have resources that have, and not just financial resources, but also emotional support, mental support, from family, from various people. So we've been lucky. But what about the others? What about the artist who performs only at a temple and does kirtan over there and earns from the offerings made by devotees? What about the qawwali singers, the qawwals who sing at shrines? Again, what are we doing about them? And in 18 months, with due respect, and please don't think that I'm running down anything. People have to take their own decisions in a democracy. So who am I to say that so and so organization should do this or do that? But I can say that about organizations that are run with taxpayers' money. I'm a taxpayer, and so why can I not not criticize, but critique what has been happening? And all I see everywhere are these videos, videos to spread positivity. The whole process of making art is one that involves an artistic struggle. It involves, it's a huge moment of creation, and artists cannot be told to be positive when they have no source of livelihood for the last 18 months, when the most reputed and most acclaimed among them have passed away without having gotten basic medical facilities. Look, Rajan Bhaiya, I, I cannot tell you how much that distressed me, not because I feel he could have been saved. I don't know his medical condition. So, how can I say whether he could have been saved or not? But I'm saying that in modern India, which we constantly say is going to become one of the biggest powers, a world power, that an ordinary citizen, leave alone a person as recognized and celebrated as Pandit Rajan Mishra ji, we could not get uh, a hospital bed for many of them. It was only through the intervention of 1 million people, through people tweeting each other for support, that these basic amenities could be given to them. And let me also tell you, I have not talked about this in public, but I will today. My husband, Anish Pradhan, and I went through COVID and 10 days of hospitalization. We have seen things at first hand. So we are not talking of any garbled media version, so-called media version, which is often criticized and said, often the media is attacked and say, why are you showing these things? We have witnessed these things firsthand. As we lay in a hospital bed in one of the biggest hospitals in India, we were fortunate to get those beds because all of this happened just before the second wave. We were listening, but we were there while the second wave came on, and we were listening to the nursing staff, to the hospital staff saying, oxygen banks are depleting. And we were wondering, what is going to happen? Where are we going to go? So healthcare, I am afraid nobody has thought of this. No political party has thought of it. And possibly they have not thought of it because they know that healthcare is not something that is going to get them votes. Dividing people may get votes, but healthcare won't. So, dividing people on the basis of caste, community, etc. might work, but not making available facilities not just to the celebrated and the powerful, but to every citizen of India. I think this terrible, tragic fact, Anish and I have witnessed firsthand. My experience has been that when we comment on any such issue, most of us, at least Anish and I, have received calls or messages from colleagues, very highly respected colleagues, saying, don't talk about this because, people will get frightened. They won't send their children to learn music. And just don't talk about it. So this idea of sweeping everything under the carpet and not addressing it has to be first, completely put away. You don't want to talk about it, no problem, but let others talk about it, because it's only when there is a discussion and a conversation that any solution may be in sight. This is, of course, a hugely complicated issue because you see, as a woman, I feel that the judicial system has let us down because it just takes too long. And the example of many women who have been brave enough to come forward and even file complaints they stand out starkly in front of us. For example, what does a Priya Ramani have to go through? She's not from the world of arts, but she made a very brave decision. What is she undergoing? She's being dragged to court every week. How many of us can afford that? How many musicians can afford that? The the time, the money that is required to fight a legal battle. We all know if women are going to leave a case like this behind for their children as inheritance, because they may pass away before any solution or any decision is reached, what is going to happen? Then can we rely on this system? So unfortunately, this is what has happened, that we cannot depend on the system to give us justice. Now, what is happening again is that people who take the decision to come out and complain or to, talk about their experiences are vilified. And I have had so many women tell me, I mean, women artists, as well as people working in the arts, whether they are music critics or whatever, why are they doing this after so many years? This is the only thing that is asked. It doesn't matter that somebody who is, who one respects, uh, who is a guru, uh, is accused of this. I'm not saying that they are convicted, but there is the accusation. Surely that has to be looked into. If you are not going to do that, if you are going to just talk about why the women have suddenly come out in the open, is that the only remark that we have? Is that the only response that we have? And then everything goes along, happily. So the people who are accused, let me put this very carefully. The people who are accused are being given awards, are being given positions, I mean, for concerts run by the state as well as by very prestigious arts organizations. So on the one hand, they are not taking cognizance of the accusations and the complaints, even if they're formal ones. On the other hand, I also feel, what if the person has been wrongly accused? So what is going to happen to their lives for the period of time that this indefinite accusation hangs on them? I think we have to find the solution to that. We have to discuss what has to be done. Is it for a period of 5 years that they are going to be boycotted? But see how easy it is for people to find solutions within their own community. If you want, let's say, to buy a house or rent a house in a megapolis kind of a city, in a big city in India today, people will tell you, do you have meat? Do you eat meat? I will not allow you to stay in my home. You find that solution, and the entire community will say, no, this is for only vegetarians, or this is only for whatever, whichever community. But the arts community doesn't ever try to think of finding a way to uh, to look, at least start discussing a solution. And what happens then? The person who has made the accusation, who has gone through this, and who has been brave enough to come out and talk about it, is left in the lurch. We have deserted them because their lives are traumatized by all the vilification they face. And there we are, every life goes on as usual. And all anybody can say is, why did they take so long? So were they party to the entire thing, to the entire inappropriate behavior, sorry. Were they party to that? I feel, really speaking, we need to sort of put together a protocol. You talked about awareness awareness programs to teach women, to teach men working with women how to behave, and what could be considered inappropriate behavior. I think that's a very good suggestion. And I think that's one that should be implemented. But I don't see a single orientation course, for example, in institutions that are teaching music. is there ever a session where men and women who are teaching are asked to come and listen to an expert in the field who can train them to say, if you were to say, remember that there is a lot of material connected with Shringar, with the erotic, with Shringar is not eroticism, and yet there is a lot that is erotic in the texts that we sing, that we dance to. There is a lot of material that could be misinterpreted. And so, what are the ways in which you explain that to a student? How do you talk about that? I mean, that in itself could be a problem area, but we don't deal with that. And when, for example, people who have in the past tried to compose, um, let's say, compositions which could be taught to children, there is another movement which says they sanitized these compositions. You know, tarring with with the same brush is not a great idea, at least in the arts. So I think these are very complicated issues. Awareness programs must be initiated and must be attended. But I suspect that if you and I were to say, let's do this on our own, let's invite people to get together and let's create an awareness session for them, I'm not sure there would be many takers for that. So I think we need to prepare ourselves to talk about the issue, look for solutions, and certainly create awareness. To be an activist, and to be an activist from any walk of life, means getting trolled and abused in the most horrific ways. It means you could be in trouble in a variety of ways. Whether there is going to be an FIR against you, and an FIR not in the city in which you live, but care is taken that the FIR is filed in some remote place, or whether it is about people coming and trying to stop you from performing at any place. I mean, you've read about all these things, you've watched these things on television, so this is nothing new. Um, Activism must come with conviction, and with conviction, you must have the strength to know that anything could happen. And you must also have, in today's world, you must also be ready that your people from your own so-called community, that is the arts community, will attack you with brickbats at the drop of a hat, even if it could be absolutely, I mean, issues that nobody could really debate about. For example, do I have the right to beat somebody to death? Do I have the right to take the law into my own hands and beat somebody to death in the middle of a street? I mean, what would anybody say about this? Who can say it is correct? Because, but, why did you not? What about? I mean, all this happens. But frankly, I ask everyone, can anyone say that people should take the law into their own hands and beat somebody to death in a public space or in a private space? What would you call such a person? But even for issues such as these, I know of many artists who will attack you with a ferocity and almost a viciousness that you never knew existed in them. These are people you've met at concerts for years, you've enjoyed their music, you've interacted with them, they've called you Didi, they've called you colleague, they've called you whatever. Suddenly, there is this, turnaround, and there is some, I don't know for what reason this happens, but it is happening more and more in current times. It's wonderful that artists are deciding to take a political stand today more than ever before. But it's also true that it's a deeply, deeply polarized, divided community, which is not thinking, not even thinking about aspects of music and the arts, which are universal. I mean, if you say that music and art transcend all boundaries, how on earth are you doing and saying the things you are? So that's what it means to be an activist and an artist in today's India. I think one of the very, very big issues that should concern a lot of people and doesn't is the issue of, let's say, the protection of traditional knowledge. Today, it is very common, for example, to find a composition in, let's say, Jhinjhoti, Rag Jhinjhoti, or in Rag Maru Bihag, sometimes even composed by a composer like Pandit Ramashray Jhaji. Not only are composers not acknowledged, not only are sources not acknowledged, but also they become the property of whichever record label actually chooses to produce that particular album. And sometimes it leads to strange, laughable situations also, but then you don't feel like laughing about them for too long. For example, a record label that owns the rights to some of Begum Akhtarji's music. Now, she was a very popular performer. And so a lot of fusion programs and fusion albums are also made with, let's say, something like "Eh Mohabbat Tere Anjam Pe Rona Aaya," or let's say, "Chha Rahi Kali Ghata." Neither is the Shair, the poet, acknowledged. Neither is the source acknowledged, that is, that Begum Akhtar sang this. But the record or the album or the track is published and distributed saying traditional. I think it's important to document the source, not for only for purposes of royalty seizing and royalty acquisitions, but also as a teaching tool. How will you know who actually first made this popular, or who first recorded this, who composed it? Very often that is not known as well. But how will you know it if this is not documented and recorded properly? And the least that we can do, I mean, we were always taught in our talim that if we were taught a bandish and we were told that when you sing this, acknowledge that person and either do a namaskar or hold a hand to your heart or whatever, make a gesture of respect for that person. If this is part of our tradition, then why are we forgetting it so conveniently? Again, this needs to be addressed, and both Anish and I have tried to work on these aspects by arranging for lectures. We did an entire, I think it was a 2-day conference on intellectual property rights. Earlier, we had been part of a project where we invited people to speak about performers' rights. The issue of performers' rights is a very big one. Today, anybody who invites us to perform takes it for granted that we are also giving them the rights to audio and video record and do whatever they like with it. And it's just taken for granted. And we've had many problems with that. Whereas the Indian law is very clear. You cannot do that. If you have invited somebody to perform, that's all that you are entitled to. You can only organize their performance and present it to the public. You cannot record it. You cannot appropriate that recording and do whatever you like with it. Unfortunately, the biggest organizations, the biggest arts organizations, people who say they are working for the good of arts and artists, are not sensitive to these issues. And of course, by and large, in a larger general perspective, artists are left to fend for themselves. The idea of arranging for medical insurance for them, or the idea of arranging for event insurance. When I go on stage, I am not the person who's building a stage, am I? It's the organizer who hires somebody to either build the stage, or if it's a venue, like let's say a well-known venue in a big city, the venue is responsible for safety norms. But if you make a stage where the cables are not connected properly, or the lights come crashing down on you, barely missing you by a fraction, or the cables could have electrocuted you, is anybody taking responsibility for that? Those insurances must come from the organizers and from the venues. And similarly, medical insurance, insurance of instruments, Indian instruments, you do know that it is not possible to insure acoustic handcrafted instruments in India. The insurance sector has had a huge boom, but try and insure a sitar or a tanpura or a sarod and see what you go through. We've tried to address those issues. In 2020, in March, when the lockdown was announced for the first time, and in fact, when all of a sudden, like a pack of cards, every concert assignment I had came crashing down within almost 1 week, we realized that we are going to face a big problem, and it's not going to go away in a week or a month. So along with 5 other colleagues and friends, all working in the arts, so Anish and me and 4 other friends, Samira Iyengar, who works with theatre, Rahul Vora, who's an actor and a curator and presenter, Mona Irani, who's a casting person, and also Arundhati Ghosh, who's an arts administrator. 6 of us got together to do a crowd-funded fundraising project called ADA, Assistance for Disaster-Affected Artists. And we approached 10 organizations that have had a great reputation for working at grassroots level in different states. And we said, let's try and collect money for, and try and give this money to 100 artists, 10 from each state, for them and their families for basic provisions. And since it is not possible for all of us who are living in Delhi and Mumbai to know who really needs this assistance, let's try and approach it as a 6-month-long kind of assistance that will look after your basic needs. And we were pleasantly surprised. We thought it's going to be a huge struggle, but within about a month, we raised enough money. We exceeded our target actually, and we received contributions from arts organizations, from artists, many of them, and from individuals and even music students. And we were able to provide assistance to 136 families of artists over a period of 6 months. So these are some of the very tiny things that we have been, Anish and I have been associated with. And I think there must be so many artists who are working on similar projects in their own areas. But really, this we need to do not only because we are from within the field, but frankly, because nobody else cares and nobody else will do anything. The wonderful gurus I learned from would teach me and then say, khud karo. This idea of letting you do things on your own. And I think this is actually a stumbling block in the teaching of Hindustani classical music. Till the point that you're repeating after your guru, many people do very well. But at the point where they have to sever that kind of oral umbilical cord and start living on their own, living their musical lives on their own, things become problematic. And so if your talim has taught you to keep studying your voice, if your talim has told you to keep studying it and analyzing it brutally, because remember, the voice also ages, the voice changes, your voice is part of your body, and you're using your body as various parts of your body as resonators. So if it's only the nasal passage which is resonating too much, And because you've decided that your guru had this slightly nasal tone, and you try to imitate them, you could end up being overly nasal without even knowing it. And it's only if you're taught to keep listening to yourself, and only if these issues are discussed, that you first even sort of start taking note of them. I think, one of the things that I find very helpful, it's like being in front of a mirror. If I stand in front of a mirror today, there is no way I can tell myself that I'm not overweight, you know. And in the same way, if I record myself, there's no way I can tell myself that, here I feel a strain in my voice, or here my voice is not accurate. So the ability today to record yourself, even on home devices, and listen to yourself really is very helpful. And I find myself telling my students very often to record themselves, whether it is to listen to the tone and timbre and texture of their voices, or whether it is uh, to find out whether they have understood a rag and are interpreting it properly. Because when I'm teaching them, the natural tendency is that the moment they make what I perceive as a mistake, I will correct them. Finally, they have to render that rag themselves. It is their interpretation. And so often I find myself, and in these 18 months, it's been terribly difficult, but I find myself, even before the pandemic, I was telling them to record themselves, put it on a private link on, let's say, something like SoundCloud, and for me to listen to. And in fact, earlier SoundCloud had this wonderful, you could add a note, like a comment, at a particular point in the track. That was very helpful, because I would say, you're using, let's say, Shuddha Madhyam too much in this rag. You should be using it less at that particular point. So I think really it is important to study one's voice, important to study how we are interpreting. And for all of this to happen, it is the guru who must actually point you towards this self-study and this ability to analyze what you're doing. And of course, with help, the guidance must come from the guru. But it's only when you start saying, Avaz pe dhyan do, that the student is going to even wonder. Otherwise, in India, there are wonderful voices, Many of the students who come to learn from me have the most gorgeous voices. And it's lovely to hear them. But those gorgeous voices need to be protected and made even more gorgeous. And so how do you do that? Unless you tell them, listen, this is going to help you, or this is your limitation, this is your strength. Try and work on both of these. Anish is a scholar of history and also of music. His work, his academic work, combines these two areas that he is specialized in. And I have really learned a lot from that. There's really a lot of guidance that I received from him. And also, he's a very keen listener. Very often people feel that because he's a tabla player, he will not listen to instrumental music or know anything about it, or will not have listened to vocal music. Sometimes I get the feeling that he's more keen a listener than I am, even of vocal music and instrumental music. And so it's wonderful to listen together and by ourselves, and then exchange what we feel we have heard and what are the important aspects of a certain piece of music. Anish is also very willing to experiment. So he really will not say, I can't do this. Very often, I find myself being tied, almost anchored too strongly to rag and tal. Whereas when we are experimenting, I find that Anish is absolutely open to the idea of breaking free. And I think all of these wonderful things about him really are certain aspects that I've learned from. And of course, I receive a lot of uh, critiquing from him as well. He can be my, I won't call him my worst critic, but my best critic, because he's really honest about his response or reaction to something I've done. And that really is very comforting for me, that whatever may happen, whether people are saying this is a terrible piece of music that you've made or a fabulous piece of music that you make, Anish may have a completely different take on it, and he's very honest about it. And I think I really cherish and respect that. I'd really like to request everyone who's listening to somehow create a space in their lives for music and the arts. I'm not going to prescribe what kind of music and what kind of arts, but really anything that they can do to create a space in their lives for the companionship of arts. I think that's a very important thing. And I think, across the world, people say and often ask me, how can they help make the lives of artists better? People want to donate, contribute. I don't even want to prescribe how much to contribute and donate. Just listen to them, and just listen to different kinds of musicians, because there is always this entire this entire treasure house of music waiting for you across the world, and of course in India. There are so many artists we haven't listened to, I haven't listened to. If we start looking for those artists and if we start listening to them, I'm sure we'll find a way to make them a part of our lives. I just hope that each person who listens will create the space in their lives only for the company and the companionship that the arts are so good at providing.